Picture this. Your patient wants to lose weight and gain some muscle. So they ask you, how much protein should I eat? How would you answer him? Or maybe you're chatting at the gym while everyone is talking about creatine, and someone says, I've heard it helps with muscles, but what does it actually do? Being the medical professional, you should know the answer, right? I'm Colleen Sloan, a PA, dietitian, and your nutrition mentor. Welcome to the Exam Room Nutrition Podcast, your guide to giving better nutrition advice. Today's episode continues with the topic of sports nutrition, but since the last two episodes have been focused on teens and young athletes, I asked my friend Erik Bustillo to share insights into adult sports nutrition and best practices for losing fat and gaining muscle. Erik is a sports dietitian and performance coach, and we go way back to undergrad at FIU in Miami. But Erik has gone on to become a leading voice in the sports nutrition world. In this episode, first Erik breaks down the basics of macronutrients and whether we should be tracking them or not. Then, for those of you who are trying to gain muscle while staying lean, you'll learn which nutrients to prioritize and why. Next, Erik unpacks 3 popular diets: keto, intermittent fasting, and paleo, and how to make these eating styles fit you or your patient's unique goals and who might benefit from them. We even cover the often debated topic of fasted cardio and whether it might work for you. And you know we can't talk sports nutrition without bringing up the topic of electrolytes and creatine supplements. Erik is going to unpack when we need them and how to avoid wasting money on the wrong products. And Erik's explanation of the 3 different energy systems is one of the best explanations I've ever heard. Plus, he goes into what the latest research is telling us about creatine and how it goes beyond just building muscle. I love this episode because Erik gives us specifics. I'm talking grams per kilogram for carbs and protein, specifics on creatine and electrolytes. So, to make your life easier, I have typed up a simple cheat sheet for you so you can easily remember and apply what you learned today. Just go to examroomnutrition.com/numbers and you can download it completely for free. It's my way of saying thanks for listening. All right, well, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Erik. Well, hey, Erik, thank you so much for coming onto my podcast today. I cannot wait to get into this topic with you. Now, before we get started, can you just share with my audience a little bit about your background and who you are?
Yeah, most definitely. First off, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be on here and to see you after so many years of not seeing you in person. I've had a pretty diverse background. I had the opportunity to work at a doctor's office for quite some time, but in that doctor's office, I was exposed to sick individuals, not so sick individuals, and professional athletes. So it was a cool combination of medical nutrition therapy, but also sport nutrition and performance nutrition. I was running metabolic carts in that practice, like so VO2 max tests and all those sorts of things. But I've also had experience in the research world. I've had the opportunity to do corporate wellness. So a couple of buddies and we started a corporate wellness company where we can help employers with coaching their employees and those sorts of things. I also do a lot of work with tactical athletes, police, fire, military. So I travel all over the country and educate/counsel different individuals in this space. And I also had the opportunity to be the dietitian/sport nutritionist for the Florida International University football team for about a year and a half. So I've had a pretty diverse background, but everywhere that I've been, educating people and connecting with them has always been a huge part of it, whether it was one-on-one or in group settings.
You're just a wealth of knowledge, and I can't wait to pick your brain because although my audience won't work probably with athletes in the capacity that you have, some of them are athletes. You know, a lot of us are adult athletes or at least trying to get back into shape. Maybe we were high school athletes and we're wanting to get back into it. So I am just so excited to dig into this topic. So I wanted to first start with a big one, and that's talking about macros, because this is sort of like a trendy word, you know, and it's kind of thrown around in CrossFit a lot, like, oh, I'm counting my macros, or what are your macros? So I would love if you can just kind of break down macros and really let us know how important is it for us to actually track our macros. And let's talk to just the average adult athlete.
Sure, yeah. I think it's a great question. Macros, that's short for macronutrients. And what are our macronutrients? We have protein, fat, and carbohydrate. And we could also throw alcohol into that mix, although Whether it really provides us with nutrients can be debatable, but still it provides us with calories, right? And we know that each macronutrient, it plays a different role in our body. So the whole point of macros is that they contribute calories to our daily nutrient intake. And that's why they're called macros, the big picture. Micros are your vitamins and minerals and all of that. So if we're looking at the purpose of counting your macros, in my opinion, it's a useful tool, right? I think it could be educational for people. I don't want anyone to ever start obsessing about what they're eating, how much they're eating. I just want something like this to raise awareness. Why is that? A lot of people think that they eat less than what they actually do consume. And with that, a lot of people also think they do more than what they actually do. So they think that their 30 to 90-minute workout burned 900 calories, so they're going to go eat the entire box of pizza. I'm not going to judge you for eating the entire box of pizza, but counting your macros raises this awareness, right? A lot of times I find myself talking about mindfulness and moderation. Mindfulness is paying attention to what you're eating, how much you're eating. Counting or tracking your macros can help with that. It's not the only way, but it can give you objective data. But then moderation is going to look different for everybody, right? Not everyone is going to follow the same one size fits all for moderation. So the individual with diabetes, their moderation for carbs is going to be different than the person who doesn't have diabetes and is training for an Ironman, let's just say. So from an objective standpoint, macros are nice because it makes you think about, what am I consuming? How many people just reach into that mixed nut jar that's sitting at their desk whenever they have the opportunity, whether they're working in the hospital and they just can go and grab it, or they're sitting at their desk and they're a C-suite individual who has meetings nonstop and they're just kind of snacking on whatever it is. So it helps shift that focus. And then the last point that I'll mention on these macros is their purpose as far as nutrients physiologically. We know that fat is very important for things like brain health, hormone function, fat-soluble vitamin function. We know that protein is important for muscle mass. Even though only 10% of the protein we eat goes to our muscle, that's a very important, only 10%. And then we also know that protein is important for enzyme production, transportation of nutrients, and then of course carbs, which unfortunately carbs have gotten a really bad rap, but we know that carbs are important for providing us with energy to perform. Sure, they can vary depending on our physical output, but if we are not getting enough carbs, our body's going to start using protein and fat for fuel and energy, and we want protein and fat to be used for those other things that I just mentioned. So we might as well use the carbohydrates properly.
Oh, you mentioned so many good things there. And I love that you had said that, carbohydrates have been like demonized lately. But I feel like right now, so many things are demonized, like everything right now is toxic and causes inflammation, and it can be very confusing. But I love your approach of mindfulness and moderation because that simplifies it. Nutrition isn't simple, but it can be. You don't have to, overcomplicate the foods that you're eating. And I've been in the CrossFit athlete world for a really long time, and I actually don't count my macros, but people are actually really surprised when, I don't know exactly how many grams of carbohydrates I've eaten that day. And that's what I tell them. I'm like, I don't really need to because I know what my body needs. I'm eating, like you said, in mindfulness and moderation. So I love that piece right there that you had mentioned. So if you guys wanted to dig a little bit deeper into macros, I actually have an episode on that. It's episode 36 called How to Count and Calculate Your Macros. So go back and listen to that one after this episode. So I wanted to talk about two different individuals here. And let's talk about the first person who is trying to gain weight and muscle simultaneously. But I'm thinking about, the 30s, 40s, 50s-year-old who really want to put on some weight, especially muscle mass. And so what nutrients should they prioritize? What should they be thinking about?
So as far as prioritizing nutrients, I would say all of them. They're all important. But I have found that underconsumption of protein is more common than I think a lot of us think. So if anything, I think raising awareness to protein intake can be very important for these individuals in particular. Of course, this is not talking about their training routine, right? Because training is something else. And for those that might not know, my master's is applied exercise science and sport nutrition. I've been a strength coach for I don't know how many years now, a personal trainer for longer than that. And I'm also certified, I didn't say it's not certified, but a level 2 CrossFit coach. But the training is important. If you're running 5Ks every day and you want to put on muscle mass, you're not doing the right thing. So all the nutrients are important for those people. But if I were to narrow it down, I would especially focus on overall calories coming in and how much protein they're taking in.
Let's linger here a little bit and talk specifics, because I know my listeners are like, ooh, how much protein do I need, right? So can you give us some guidelines on grams per kilogram, what the latest guidelines are? Because, and I think you and I have gone back and forth on this on LinkedIn, the RDA for protein for adults is quite low, and
Yep.
a lot of new research is changing. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on protein needs for this individual.
Most definitely. My go-to, and this is whether someone is active or not active, and some people will disagree with this, but I like the 1.6 gram per kilogram, or that'll be about 0.73 grams per pound. That's where I like to be. That RDA of 0.8 gram per kilogram, I just find it to be so low, right? And then we wonder why people have trouble controlling their hunger, why people are having cravings left and right. Obviously, there are other things that will play a role into that, like stress being one of those. But we know that protein underconsumption is going to have a huge impact on something like satiety, right? And then anecdotally, I haven't dug into the research on this, but anecdotally, I have seen protein underconsumption leads to wanting those sweets and those sorts of things, maybe because they're under fueling, right? So 1.6 gram per kilogram, or like I said, 0.73 grams per pound of body weight is usually the floor for protein that I recommend. Technically, can you do a little bit less than that? Yes, but I like to make that reach for the stars. So, if you fall, you land on a cloud kind of thing. That's my thought process with the protein. And the last point there is, if you do more than 1.6 grams per kilogram, it's not detrimental. If you wanted to do 1 gram per pound of body weight or 2.2 grams per kilogram, then by all means, you can go ahead and do that. If anything, I just want people to focus on, am I getting enough protein on a regular basis?
Yeah, that's a really good point there. But I want to back up to kind of the first thing that you had said is they have to fuel properly. So if they're under fueled but eating a ton of protein, that might not always lead to weight gain, muscle mass gain, right? Because they need to meet their target calories. And so how important are carbohydrates and fats, the other macronutrients, for individuals who are trying to gain weight and gain muscle?
Okay, so I'm gonna answer this in a vacuum, and everyone knows life, training, everything does not exist in a vacuum. But purely from a weight standpoint, calories are going to be the most important factor, right? I mean, technically, can you put on muscle mass by eating your caloric needs in Oreos? I mean, technically, yes. Do I recommend it? Absolutely not. Because you're probably leaving some muscle on the table, so to speak. You're leaving some health on the table as well from a nutrient standpoint. So as far as carbohydrates go, I would 100% recommend not cutting out your carbs entirely, but also don't start thinking that you have to start eating 600 grams of carbohydrate per day. Some people might, right? But not everybody. The general individual is probably going to be okay with somewhere around 3 or 4 grams per kilogram of body weight when it comes to carbohydrates. Of course, that's a generalization, but I want people to kind of think about the fact that, hey, I don't have to only eat 100 grams of carbohydrate. Depending on how much you weigh or what your target weight is and what your training looks like, your carbs are going to vary. And you could even carb cycle if you wanted. For some people, if they have a lighter training day or they're taking a day off, they might find themselves having less carbohydrates. Personally, I don't do that, not for myself, because my training tends to be pretty hard. And even if I have a day where I'm doing nothing, I'm still recovering from yesterday. And tomorrow is also going to be tough as it is. So I'm trying to maintain my calories and my macronutrients where they're at. Side note, similar to you, Colleen, I don't track my macros. I have in the past, but it's not something that I do regularly. I kind of intuitively know what my body needs, but that's what I would recommend on the carbohydrate front. On the fats, what I would tell people is try to make sure your fats aren't getting any lower than 20% of your total calories. We have seen in the research, once you start getting under 20%, you start risking some detriment to your hormones. And we want to prevent that, among other things, right? Fats are an easy way to get calories. Carbohydrates are also an easy way to get calories. If someone is having trouble eating enough, I remind them, hey, eat some rice and beans. That's an easy, few hundred calories right there, depending on how much you're taking in. So that's kind of where my stance is with carb and fat. We don't have to overly restrict, but we want to be smart about how much we're taking in with those.
That was really, really helpful. Now let's talk the flip side. And those are individuals who want to lose weight and build muscle. And so generally, not all the time, but I often hear this from women, premenopausal, or maybe they've had a couple kids and they're trying to get back into it. So they really want to lose some weight and tone up so they can look sexy. So do the guidelines change a little bit for them? What should they be focusing on when it comes to the macronutrients and things like that?
Some people might not like this answer, but it doesn't really change a whole lot. There should still be a strong focus on protein, adequate calories, right? So even for men or for women, if you're trying to lose weight, we know that from a thermodynamic standpoint, calories matter. Calories coming in, calories going out, just like a bank account, just like your car uses gas and all those sorts of things. But we do have to consider this. Over restriction is dangerous. Eating too little is dangerous. This can have severe detrimental effects on things like bone health, which for all of us as we're aging, longevity is something else that I talk a lot about. Keeping your muscle and bone, that's like the fountain of youth, if you will, right? So for anyone who is looking to lose some body fat and hopefully build or at least hold on to their muscle mass, lifting weights is number one, by far the most important factor. From a dietary standpoint, getting into a caloric deficit. So if your total daily energy expenditure is estimated to be around 3,000 calories and you want to lose a little bit of body fat, I wouldn't say jump down to 2,000 calories. I would start pretty conservatively and I would say, let's start with a 300 calorie deficit, right? Maybe 500 calorie deficit. So that's 2,700 calories, 2,500 calories. And then we'll see how it goes from there. It's slow, but that being slow, it shows us two things. One, hopefully you are making habit changes, which is important for the long run, right? Sustainability. The second thing is hopefully we are not losing muscle mass, which is very important from a functionality standpoint. So that would kind of be my answer to the woman or the man, whomever, really.
I love your answer because we can get so hung up on aesthetics and the scale number, but I really love that you focused in on longevity and bone health because we forget that, especially for a lot of our patients, they're not thinking about what they're going to feel like and how they're going to be able to live every day in 10, 15 years, So I think that's a really important point that what we eat today really will impact us and we can either set ourselves up for success in years to come, or we can be doing a lot of harm by trying to get the ideal, perfect body. I want to linger here and just pick your brain a little bit on something that just popped into my mind, and that's on some different diets that are around right now. So I want to pick your brain on three really popular ones, especially kind of in the CrossFit world right now. So it's keto diet, intermittent fasting, and the paleo diet. So I would love just kind of your thoughts on those. If our patients ask for our opinions about those, who those might work for, and if you think that those might be a good option for some of our patients.
Yeah, I think that almost every dietary approach has a time and place. So as far as those specific ones, keto, fasting, and paleo, keto has a time and place. For me, it's individuals who suffer from epilepsy. We know that as a form of medical nutrition therapy, it's a very viable and powerful tool to help manage individuals suffering from seizures. Outside of that, if someone is doing it for body composition, can it be helpful? It can, right? We know that people, from a rules standpoint, in air quotes, people can easily follow keto because it's no bread, no rice, no potato, no pasta, no happiness, right? No any of that. So from a rule standpoint, it's easy, but it's not sustainable, right? And in fact, side note, I remember I was working with a patient one time. Actually, I wasn't working with him. They just saw me to review their blood work. And they actually did keto. And the guy had lost somewhere between 20 and 30 pounds. And I was like, okay, that was you were pursuing intentional weight loss. Awesome. You experienced it. His LDL cholesterol went from 114 to 195. And I was just kind of like, now I'm not one to demonize nutrients or blood markers or anything. We know we need LDL cholesterol, but we also know if you're walking around with chronically elevated LDL cholesterol, is it a heart attack waiting to happen? Not necessarily, but the risk is increased, right? So it's important for people to know that these extreme things can oftentimes be potentially hurtful for individuals. So that's my thing with keto. As far as fasting goes, I also think there's a time and place for it. I think that fasting, for some people, it can help them regulate their hunger, their appetite. Yes, they might be hungry at first, but once their body gets used to it, and I'm a firm believer that for the most part, we can train ourselves to do just about anything, including fasting intermittently, or as we'll, the 16-8 rule, fast for 16 hours and eat within the 8-hour window. The terminology is changing, and now that's not necessarily technically considered intermittent fasting. In the literature, they're starting to call it just time restricted eating. But those are just, technicalities, if you will. I think that there's a time and place for it. For my tactical athletes, especially if they have to go overseas, what I like to suggest to them is if there's any remote possibility of you having to perform at a high level in a fasted state, I would encourage you to train yourself to do it here, stateside, in a controlled environment, because now you show yourself two things. One, that you can do it. Two, that if it does happen overseas, it'll happen potentially a little bit faster because you've done it before, right? And then paleo. The thing with paleo is eat like a caveman or a cavewoman, right? But what part of the world? Because depending where you're at in the world, you're going to have access to different things. Obviously, that's kind of like a joke slash poking fun of the paleo diet. But what I like about paleo is that, if anything, it helps people eat more whole foods and get away from the processed stuff. And that's a good thing. I'm not anti-processed food, but overconsumption is the root of all evil when it comes to dietary and health related things. We can easily overconsume processed foods. I think paleo helps gravitate people towards more whole foods. So everything has its time and place. In my opinion, just don't be an extremist about it. Keto is not typically sustainable. Fasting, generally speaking, can be difficult for a lot of people to do. In some cases, it might lead to overconsumption later on in the day. And then paleo, unfortunately, I think maybe scares people into not eating something in particular. Oh, cavemen didn't eat bananas or something like that, and now people are afraid to eat bananas. We already have generations of people who are afraid to eat carbohydrates. So I kind of wish all of that stuff would die out. But again, there's a time and place for everything. It depends on the situation.
Great answer. And, carbohydrates are so important for athletes, especially anyone who does any kind of endurance sports, even weight training and everything like that. So
Yeah.
I would love to hear your thoughts on fasted cardio, because this comes up a lot and it kind of like loops around in popularity. So what are your thoughts on fasted cardio for people?
Well, I think fasted cardio, like the other diets that we just mentioned, I think fasted cardio, not a diet, but I think that it has its time and place. I think if someone does not feel good training after eating something, well, hopefully they're working with their dietitian to kind of coach them into finding things that they can consume. Because what the literature shows is eating before a workout, especially an intense training session that probably entails weights and all of that, we benefit more from eating something, from getting some sort of nutrients in the body. But now, if someone has GI issues, for me as a dietitian, the main thing that I want to avoid is any GI distress while they are training. So if fasted cardio is going to help them perform their cardio best, then great. But then I would also ask them, what does your cardio look like? If your cardio is a very light, easy pace, 2-mile jog, you probably don't really need to eat a whole lot before that. I would focus, if anything, on hydration, maybe some electrolytes. You probably don't need a whole lot of nutrients there. Now, if you're going to do sprints and all these sorts of things, then you probably want something in your system. Typically, my go-tos are going to be some sort of carbohydrate. I like to recommend a banana if someone can stomach that. So trial and error is extremely important here. Or even something like honey. 1 to 2 tablespoons of honey, some pretty easy sugar in the system. Now, why do we want those carbohydrates in the system? I think it's important for people to remember the 3 different energy systems. We have that phosphagen or phosphocreatine energy system that is like 10 seconds of intense training. So, 5 reps on bench press, right? Not very aerobic, so you don't really need oxygen. Not very demanding in the sense of time. So you're using predominantly phosphocreatine at a cellular level. The next energy system is the glycolytic pathway. There, we're predominantly using carbohydrates. So if you're doing relatively intense bouts for longer than a minute, if anywhere from like a minute to 4 minutes, maybe 6 minutes, and especially intervals, your body's going to start tapping into using carbohydrates. The carbs become very important there. And then, of course, the third energy system is oxidative, where we're predominantly using fat for fuel. That's longer duration, but lower intensity. So my example there is phosphagen is so sprinting on an echo bike for 5 seconds, right? Nothing too crazy. Then going as fast as you can on an echo bike for 2 minutes. It's going to look different than 5 seconds. It's going to be pretty intense, right? But a little different from 5 seconds. And then as many calories as you can on an echo bike for 45 minutes. All are going to look different. All have some form of different energy needs. So it's going to depend on what your fasted cardio is going to look like. And I would recommend, sure, maybe do it, but no, you might be leaving some performance on the table because intensity does play a role in getting results.
As you guys can tell, nutrition is so nuanced. So if you're not working with a dietitian or if you don't refer your patients to a dietitian, especially athletes, it's so important. I mean, every question that I'm asking Erik, you can tell it's, well, it depends. Oh, well, it depends. And that is the point of nutrition. As individuals, we are all different and all of our needs are really different. So that's why working with someone like Erik is so crucial.
And I appreciate that. And just as a side note, it's like, think about someone has hypothyroidism. We're not just going to give the same dose of levothyroxine to everyone. We're going to see, are you starting at 0.5? Are you starting at, whatever it might be? Nutrition it's like that. It's so individualized. I think everyone should really know that. So thank you for making me think of that because it's so true.
Yeah. And we say it, right? I mean, even in PA school, we are trained to give individualized medical care. Like I use air quotes saying that, but when it comes to nutrition, it feels like very black and white and people want it to be black and white, but in order to thrive and to be optimally fueled and to perform at your peak, you have to have it individualized. Okay. I want to jump over into electrolyte replacements and who needs them? When are they helpful? Who should we be suggesting them for?
I like to remind people that you don't need an electrolyte product to optimize your health and performance. There's a time and place for those also. I think that a lot of people can probably just benefit from adding some salt and like a banana to their diet to get some of that sodium and potassium. Don't get me wrong. We don't want to leave like magnesium out on the table. Of course, we'd want to do that. But, statistically speaking, 60 to 70% of the US population is deficient in magnesium and might want to consider a magnesium supplement as it is. But adding a little bit of salt can go a long way for people, especially if they're being active individuals. Historically, what was the messaging about sodium? Less. Salt is bad. Blood pressure, heart attack, and all these things, which of course we know that extreme answers are the solution. You guys might hear my niece in the background. She, in my opinion, is the cutest baby ever. Of course, I think every uncle will say that. So now we've seen a shift with a lot of these electrolyte products. You're seeing this shift in having salt is not the enemy. You need more salt. The message is not entirely wrong, but more salt doesn't mean all the salt. So there are some products that might have 1,000 milligrams of sodium. And a colleague of mine was working with someone, and she shared the story with me, who was consuming per day 5 packets of this one particular company of electrolyte solution, 1,000 milligrams of sodium per packet. So only in these little packets, they were getting 5,000 milligrams of sodium on top of whatever they're eating. Because guess what, folks? We eat sodium also. So that could be a problem. Of course, they were complaining of bloating and all that. So, who'd have thunk it, right? I think very active individuals can benefit from adding these electrolyte products. I think that if someone sweats a lot, if they live in a very hot and humid climate, it can be beneficial. I think it could also be beneficial for people who live in altitude to utilize these. How much do you use? Well, it really depends. It depends on how long your training session lasts, how much you sweat. So these are all things that are going to play a role. And I don't have a one size fits all answer, but I have all of those considerations for people to have in mind. And then, of course, something like electrolyte boost, like the one on my shirt, right? Like, how are you taking it in? What's kind of cool about this is that it's waterless delivery. So it's almost like a pixie stick where you're getting some electrolytes and you're getting a supplement called cognizin that it's a acetylcholine supplement, good for brain health. It might help with memory and attention and all that. But for like police officers who are on patrol, waterless delivery might be good, right? But when I say waterless delivery, I don't ever want anyone to think I'm trying to take away from hydration, because this electrolyte boost product is not a hydration supplement. It's electrolytes and cognition. You still have to make sure you're drinking enough fluid throughout the day. And that's also very individualized. So again, not a one size fits all answer, but there's a time and place for it all. Just try with adding some salt to your food and having a banana or something high in potassium to kind of get you started. If you're training very hard and you sweat a lot, maybe consider some form of an electrolyte supplement that can fit your needs.
Yeah. And I mean, the market for it has exploded. I know there's tons of options now, even if you just
Yep.
go to your traditional like grocery store. And really looking at the label is important, and working with a dietitian is important, because it depends even when you're going to be taking this. There is a lot that are out there that have carbohydrates in it, simple sugars in it. And that would be best before you work out, right? So I know there's some nuance there. So what are some things people should look for in an electrolyte supplement?
Well, one of them, you made a great point, is whether it has carbohydrates or not, depending on your needs. Now, the good news is that I've found, or I should say, I haven't seen one that has an insane amount of carbohydrate. So generally speaking, if it's going to be like 10 or 15 grams of carbs and you're doing something active, all right, not that big a deal. But it depends on the person. Are they managing blood sugar levels? Are they being, very intelligent with how many calories they're taking in? There, the lower calorie option might be beneficial. So keeping an eye on that. I would also keep an eye on how much sodium it's going to have, because you might not need the 1000 milligram one. You might not need the 300 milligram one. Maybe 200 milligrams is fine. Or taking half of one of those if you like whichever. And there's so many products out there. You have Liquid IV, Drip Drop, Element, like the Noon tabs, obviously Electrolyte Boost. You have all these different ones that are out there. So knowing whichever one suits your needs best. So looking for overall grams of carbs and sugar, which can lead into how many calories they have. You want to take a look at how much sodium and potassium and all of that. And something else that I would say is look and see if it has something that you have a negative reaction to, right? If maybe you don't do well with stevia and they use stevia as a sweetener, or maybe it's sucralose and you don't respond well to that, or a sugar alcohol, whatever it might be, you have to know yourself also. So that's, again, that topic of trial and error comes into play in knowing how you might respond to this. So those are probably the three main things: overall calories and carbs, looking for the actual amount of electrolyte in them, and if there's anything in there that will cause any sort of adverse reaction to your GI, or if you get like migraines or something from a particular nutrient, it's important to pay attention to that.
Very good point. And trial and error is okay. It's okay to try different brands. Even the taste comes into factor, because I think the Noon tablets are like fizzy. I tried
Yeah,
those and I don't like fizz. So I
same
went with a
here.
different brand. So you do have to try it and play around with it. Okay. My very last question, which actually came up in my gym literally just a few days ago. This is what made me think to ask you about creatine, because
Okay.
the coach was telling someone, hey, oh, maybe you should try creatine supplement. And then people were like, oh, well, what does it do? What is it for? And she kind of couldn't answer. So I find that so often coaches and probably even providers are suggesting a supplement and they don't really know what, what it does and what it's for. So let's talk about creatine, what your thoughts on it, but break it down, like what is its purpose in our body? Who should use it and who might it benefit?
Yeah. Okay. So earlier I mentioned the three metabolic pathways, and the first one was that phosphocreatine system. So creatine, when taken as a supplement, it helps at a cellular level. It helps with fueling us, with helping to use this fuel as energy, if you will, at a cellular level. So that's what creatine is going to help with. It helps fuel how we feel. It helps fuel our workouts. So then what's kind of cool about this is, again, at a cellular level, maybe even at the muscular level, is this can help with lifting a little bit more or training a little bit harder because you have a little bit more of these, just for lack of a better word, let's just call it like little energy blocks. That creatine is helping to support these little energy blocks at a cellular and muscular level. So it's going to help with that output, and it's going to help us just get a little bit stronger or maybe be able to run a little bit faster. I also think it's important to mention that creatine, well, for one, it's not a steroid. And people have thought that creatine is steroids and boys in high school and so on and so forth. But creatine is naturally found in the foods that we consume. And we also naturally produce creatine in our bodies. But the optimal amount of creatine is very difficult to get that just from your diet, which is where supplements come into play. I forget the exact number, but something like 1 pound of steak is about 1 gram of creatine. And I'm sorry, I enjoy steak, but I'm not going to eat 5 pounds of steak per day. So creatine is beneficial in that regard. Creatine is also kind of cool in that it's an antioxidant. So we talk a lot about antioxidants and long-term health. And well, here we are, something that can potentially help with killing off these free radicals and help with long-term health. We also have seen that creatine is potentially beneficial. And I say potentially because it's not clear cut, but it's like many sides are pointing to yes, the cognitive and brain benefits. And what we do know is if you have a traumatic brain injury, ideally you would have been taking creatine if and when that happens, because having more creatine in your system, and creatine does cross the blood-brain barrier, having more creatine in your system helps with that recovery from that traumatic brain injury. So that's a part of like my concussion protocol as far as supplements go. So I think generally speaking, people will benefit from taking creatine, and it's kind of like a blanket thing. If you don't have kidney and liver issues, you should probably take creatine. But before just jumping on creatine, I would strongly urge you to tweak, fix, and optimize your diet first and foremost. Even though you can do both at the same time, I just think that people will see creatine as the answer to everything without making these changes to their diet. And the dietary changes, no matter what, if you got a hormone replacement, dietary changes are important. You say creatine, dietary changes are important. Like no matter what, they're always going to be important. So people should know that too.
I love that you went there because people sometimes want to choose a supplement. Whereas if we just optimize the food that they're eating, they probably don't need a supplement. Like I hear this all the time in teen athletes, like asking for caffeine or an energy drink. And I'm like, well, did you have breakfast? And they don't need breakfast, So you do need to optimize your nutrition first. Okay, last question about creatine. Do we take it pre or post workout?
It doesn't matter, but if we're going to be very picky, post workout with protein might be best. But in the big picture, just take it consistently. Typically, we recommend 3 to 5 grams per day. But what we're seeing with some of the brain health data, a friend of mine, Dr. Darren Candow, he's based out of Canada. He's like one of the primary researchers on creatine. He started recommending 0.1 gram per kilogram of body weight. So if you're a 70 kilo person, 7 grams of creatine monohydrate. Yes, for the muscle benefits, but also for the potential brain and cognitive benefits. So most importantly, take it regularly. If we're going to be very picky about muscle response and all that, throw it in your shake post-workout, but you don't have to stress about doing that.
Nutrition science is just so fascinating and it's changing all the time. So I love that you came on and just shared this information with us. Share with my audience where they can connect with you, reach out to you, and even work with you.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks for having me on. It's been so much fun. And if you ever want to do it again, just let me know. On social media, I'm at Erik Bustillo, ErikBustillo. I try to be as active on there as I can. And then just with other things, any questions about like electrolyte boost, they could ask me on there. Anything from the corporate wellness side with Gifted Wellness, they could write to me on there. Any questions about O2X human performance, they could ask me on there as well. So that works. And also email erikthedietitian@gmail.com. They could reach me there.
Awesome. Well, Erik, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure learning from you and seeing you again. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me again. I appreciate it.
As a reminder, I summarized all of the numbers and guidelines Erik just mentioned in this episode in a handy little cheat sheet for you. Just head over to examroomnutrition.com/numbers to grab it for free. There's no nutrition notes today, but if you loved this episode, could you take 2 minutes and leave me a review in your podcast player? It would mean so much to me. Well, I'll see you next week where we dig into supplements even more. And until then, let's continue to make our patients healthier, one exam room at a time.